so we could start. It's just a minute or so after 7, and 3 for 3. We'd like to start on time and end on time for your benefit as well as our speaker. It's a privilege tonight to welcome Dr. Sandra Keating in a few moments in a more full way. Our schedule tonight will be like it has been in the past. Dr. Keating is going to make a formal presentation, and then, as all of our speakers have, she'll gladly attend a series of questions. We'd ask you to come over, if you're in this section, to come over behind and around. I'll help to make sure people stay in a certain order. If there are that many of you who have some questions, I have a timeline we've worked out with her. She has 2 wonderful young children and has to get back to Providence tonight, so we're going to be careful for her sake humanly to moderate that. So if you happen to be in line for a question and you just don't get a chance to ask yours, don't feel put off. And we'd just ask your respect tonight, once we finish the Q&A, to let her literally get out of the room in the good sense. It's a good hour-and-a-half ride back to Providence, and as I mentioned, she's got some pretty important responsibilities with her wonderful children tomorrow. So on behalf of Father Hebert and the great community of St. Anthony's and East Falmouth, Monsignor Hoy, our host pastor, and the Friends of Christ the King, and of course our own Our Lady of Victory in Centerville, it's a pleasure to welcome you for the last of this summer series. We thank you for making the sacrifice to come out on a summer night when you could otherwise be having a second hot dog or a third olive in your martini. And as Tom Groom said, it's not even Lent, so you don't have to be here. And we have, in these very, very tense times, these last 10 years, but in a larger perspective of human history, millennia of tensions and differences and graced opportunities. We have an expert tonight to make a presentation to us on the relationship between the Muslim and Christian dialogue, and it's a few minutes worth of a formal introduction. Dr. Sandra Keating obtained her Master of Arts degree at the Catholic University of America in 1991. She went over and then lived in Rome for a while, which is hardly a hardship. I wish she was looking for a chaplain then. But she together traveled there with her husband. They're both academics in the world of theology. There she obtained a license in sacred theology from the Pontifical Institute for the Study of Arabic and Islam in 1995 with a major in Islamic theology. Can you imagine she actually went to Italy to learn Arabic? Isn't that a great thing to just be attentive to tonight? And then came home and obtained her PhD in religious studies in the important area of the dialogue, obtained her PhD in 2001. She's a distinguished member of the faculty at Providence College, a Dominican-sponsored school many of us have great affection for over in Providence. I mentioned she's a very happy wife to a wonderful fellow with whom they have 2 children. And then in her short time, aside leading a legion of students, she's a member of the Diocesan Pastoral Council, in which she advises the Bishop of Providence on matters of import. She's active in her own parish of St. Pius V in Providence, and she serves as a longtime consultor to the Vatican Commission for Religious Relations with Muslims, obtaining a seat on that consultative body in the year 2005. So she's been around the conversation at the Vatican for a long, long time. Would you give her a nice, warm Cape Cod welcome?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to see that so many people are out this evening. I said last night that I commended Father Mark on having summer programs, because a lot of times we find that everything shuts down during the summer. Although not in my field of study, we find that there's always something going on in the relations between Muslims and Catholics, and so there's always something new going on. One of the reasons why I had submitted the title for this talk fairly late is because I always say you never quite know what's going to happen, so I don't want to say what I'm going to talk about too far in advance, because there's always something that happens. One of the questions that people often ask me is how I ended up studying interreligious dialogue with Islam, and I have to say it's not an easy, I don't have an easy explanation. Originally had begun graduate school expecting to study theology. My interest was really in Trinitarian theology and monotheism. And I had a professor once, just in a coffee break, I was talking to him about this, and he said, well, if you're interested in monotheism, you really should study Islam. This was in 1987. And I said, well, what do I need to do to study Islam? And he said, well, the first thing you need to do is to study Arabic. And I said, oh, okay, maybe I'll think about that. And so I began taking a course in Arabic, and one of the things that I found right away that was very unexpected to me was that there was a rich body of literature that had been written by Christians who had first encountered Muslims in the early 8th century, 9th century. And I began writing my dissertation, actually I started it in 1995, on a Christian writer from the early 9th century. So he died around the year 827. He was living in Baghdad, just actually in Tikrit, which you might know is the hometown of Saddam Hussein. There was a very large Christian population living in that area, and Tikrit was actually the center for the diocese there. Abu Raita, the subject of my dissertation, had written a number of letters that I think, in the end, I concluded that he was writing probably to a cleric, most likely a bishop, advising him on how to respond to the questions that Muslims had about Christians. So already in the early 9th century, we have some very sophisticated literature written by Christians in Arabic. What was interesting about this is that they are the first generation of Christians who are using Arabic rather than Syriac or Aramaic or some other native language. They begin writing in Arabic because they are now living under Muslim rule, and they come to realize that the Muslims aren't going away anytime soon. Okay, this was in the 9th century. What really fascinated me about that was that I had no idea of any of this. Most of my education had been primarily based in European history. Mostly what I had heard about the Muslims before this had to do with Muslim Spain and the Reconquista, which many of you know something about, the Inquisition. That was really the knowledge that I had of Islam. But what I came to find was that there is a very, very long history of relations between Muslims and Christians. For those of you who have read anything in the Quran, you know right away that Christians and Christians and Jews are mentioned explicitly in the Quran. In fact, a little bit of trivia in a way is that the only woman who is mentioned by name in the Quran, does anyone know who it is? Mary, okay, Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's an entire chapter, an entire surah that is dedicated to Mary and actually retells some of the stories that we find in the apocryphal Gospels about Mary. And so I really had no idea about this. Now, once again, my interest really was first and foremost in theological issues. How does one talk to a Muslim or someone who is an absolute monotheist, someone who believes that there is one God but that it cannot be a trinity? How does one talk to someone who believes that about the incarnation and about the Trinity? Does it make any difference? Should we care about that? Are there any particular reasons why we should let belief in the Trinity or the incarnation stand in the way of good relations between Muslims and Catholics? And so I began studying this, thinking in the 90s that this was mostly academic. When people asked me to explain my dissertation, they always thought it was extremely obscure, and the most common question I got was, oh, where do you think you're going to get a job? And then I defended my dissertation in May of 2001. And between the birth of my two children, I was about to fly out of Boston on 9/11 to a conference in England on Muslim-Christian relations. And I went on the internet to check what time my flight was leaving, and I saw the first plane crash into the Twin Towers. And of course, none of us knew at the time what this was about. But interestingly enough, the night before, I had been thinking, okay, now I finished my dissertation. I need to start looking for a job. What am I going to do? I need to start thinking about what I'm going to do. And it became immediately apparent that what we needed, and what we still need, are people who had thought a lot about Muslim-Christian relations, and in particular, who had a long view of history on this. As we all know, most of what we think about, what we hear in the media, really focuses on what has happened in the last 10 years. And I would say that from a longer historical perspective, what has happened in the last 10 years is really astounding. When we look at the very origins, the very beginnings of relations between Muslims and Christians, all the way up until, say, the 90s, okay, we see particular developments, a particular trajectory of relations. And in the last 10 years, a lot of things have changed. Now, where that's going to lead, we still don't know. But I think it's a good time to stop and reflect on what has happened, where we are, and perhaps what some of the next questions are. I was very lucky, in a strange sort of a way, to have studied Arabic in Rome. I went to Rome because when I began looking for a graduate program to study Arabic, I found that all of the programs that I looked at in the 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, all of the programs that were interested in Islam were in political science or in history. It was very difficult to find a place where one could study Arabic. Of course, everyone was studying Japanese, and people had been studying Russian, and of course in '89 that all became somewhat irrelevant. But in the 60s and 70s, a lot of programs had shut down their Arabic programs. And they were beginning to see that the Middle East might be of more importance, mostly for trade reasons. But it was very hard to find a place to study Arabic. And someone had pointed out to me that one could study in Rome at an institute that was focused primarily on forming priests and nuns who would be going to work in predominantly Muslim countries. So they had an entire program of theology plus Arabic language and literature that was intended to help young priests and nuns, and sometimes people who were in their second careers, who were going to work in Algeria and Egypt and Syria and Iraq, all of these different places, to minister to Christians who were living as minorities in these areas. And so I thought, well, why not study in Rome, right? You can eat Italian food and and do a degree, so I decided to do that. And it was a wonderful opportunity, but one of the things that it allowed me to do, and in retrospect, this was very important, was to become familiar with many of the activities that the Catholic Church had undertaken in Muslim countries. And so tonight, what I'm going to focus on primarily, I mean, we can all turn on CNN or Fox News or whatever and see what's going on from the political side. But what I'd like to focus on particularly tonight is what is going on from the Catholic Church's perspective. What are some of the issues that have come up? What are some of the answers that have been given? What are some of the questions that the Pope and the Vatican are interested in particularly? And perhaps propose what even you here in your own small way can do to contribute to improving relations between Muslims and Christians. One of the first things that happened right after 9/11 was that people immediately began asking, why did this happen? Who are these people? Why do they hate us? Why would they do something so terrible to us? Who are they even? Okay, who are they? Immediately there was a lot of speculation. One of the first things that I heard, in fact, I was actually shouted down in a meeting that I went to in Providence that was sponsored at Brown University. I went to kind of see what was going on, and one of the first things that people said, well, it's all because of Israel and Palestine. Okay, if it wasn't for Israel and Palestine and that conflict, this would never have happened. And there's a way in which That is, I think, a symptom. That conflict between Israel and Palestine is a symptom of a larger problem, a very important symptom, a problem that absolutely must be resolved. There's no obviously easy solution to it. If there were, we would have solved it a long time ago. It's extremely complicated and difficult. But it's more of a symptom than the source of the problem. In fact, shortly after 9/11, it became fairly clear that Al-Qaeda, the group that was responsible for 9/11, really didn't have much to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, many of the people actually didn't like each other very much. Okay, but what was interesting is that we found within the Middle East a large number of people who saw bin Laden, okay, who was behind the whole thing, as somehow a champion. Okay, when people went around and interviewed Muslims in the Middle East who had supported him, they said, "Well, what do you think of them?" And then mostly the response was, "We would never do something, okay, like the terrorist attacks, but we agree with why he did it. We agree with why he did it." The question is, why did he do it? Okay, there's lots of reasons. If you haven't, you can go online and read. It was published by The Guardian, I think it is, in England. Bin Laden's open letter to America. Okay, if you haven't read it, you can read it. It will keep you awake at night. It's a long list of complaints against Americans. All of the things that America has done that has undermined and humiliated the Muslim people. Okay, and I oftentimes in many of my classes I have my students read it, and they're always quite shocked by it. They're always quite shocked because, in general, even if they have critiques of America, in general they think it's kind of a good thing to be an American, and that most Americans are good-willed and want to help and want to do things positively in the world. How could somebody think that, as bin Laden says, America is the worst country, the worst nation of people that has ever existed? I think there are lots of reasons for this, but one of the things that is very much at the center of the question, or the center of the problem, is the conflict with secularization. And we saw many of the issues that came out in the formulation of the Iraqi Constitution. Okay, if any of you followed that a few years ago, when the Iraqis put together a constitution, there were lots and lots of debates about what it ought to look like. And one of the big debates that came out was whether or not Iraq ought to declare itself a Muslim country. And if it did that, what would that mean for non-Muslims living in Iraq? Okay. The arguments that were made in favor of calling it a Muslim country were that if you have a majority of Muslims in a country, Muslims have a right, according to this way of presenting it, that Muslims have a right to live in a society that is structured and based or founded on Islamic principles. Okay, what would Islamic principles be? At the very basis of Islamic law is the idea that human beings, in order to flourish and in order to live well, to be truly human, need to be able to fulfill the requirements that God has given to them. The short version of these requirements, kind of the duties, what we can call the duties of God, duties to God. The Islamic law is divided into two parts: duties to God and duties to family and society. The duties to God are essentially the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay? Belief in God, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, pilgrimage,